The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as familiar to the farmers of Black Hawk County as the hum of a two-cylinder John Deere. But Jedediah Stone wasn't listening to the chant. His eyes were fixed on Lot 47, a carcass of a tractor slumped in the back row where the junk was piled. It was a monster, an early versatile D100, one of the first articulated four-wheel drives to show up in this part of Iowa. Or what was left of one. It sat there like a wounded beast, its massive dual tires flat and cracked, the rubber peeling away from the rims like old bark. The center pivot, the very heart of an articulated tractor, was twisted at a sick angle. One of the huge planetary hubs was leaking a slow black blood puddle of gear oil into the dusty ground. The sheet metal was dented and creased, the original red paint faded to a chalky pink, scarred by deep gouges of rust. Someone had painted a crude name on the hood years ago, Big Ed, but the letters were now peeling ghosts. The Cummins diesel under the hood was a question mark of the worst kind. The exhaust stack was uncovered, a gaping invitation for years of rainwater to trickle down into the cylinders. A murmur of laughter rippled through the crowd of bib overalls and seed corn caps as the auctioneer finally turned his attention to it. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this project?" He chuckled. "Good for a boat anchor, or maybe a mailbox post. Who'll give me $50? $50 to haul her away?" Jed felt a familiar presence slide up beside him. Frank Miller. Frank always seemed to materialize whenever there was an opportunity for scorn. He smelled of new denim and dealer-supplied aftershave, a stark contrast to the scent of solvent and old iron that clung to Jed. "Looking for a new planter weight, Jed," Frank said, a smirk playing on his lips. He gestured with a thumb toward his own rig parked near the road, a brand-new John Deere 4020, its green paint so bright it hurt the eyes, the tires still showing the little rubber nubs from the factory. It was the second new tractor Frank had bought in 3 years. The bank, everyone knew, loved Frank Miller. "Just looking," Jed said, his voice low and even. He didn't turn his head. He was calculating. He'd spent the morning walking around the Versatile, kicking the tires, peering at the engine block, trying to gauge the depth of the disaster. The frame itself, the heavy steel rails that formed its backbone, seemed straight. That was the main thing. The rest was just steel, bearings, and time. $25, someone shouted from the back, followed by a wave of laughter. "I got 25, who'll give me 30? The auctioneer called. Jed's father, a man who had survived the Depression by running a single paid-for Farmall F-20, had burned a simple creed into his son's mind. "If you can't pay for it with the cash in your pocket, son, you can't afford it. The bank ain't your partner. It's a landlord, and the rent is always due." Jed had cash in his pocket. 3 good years of corn prices had left him with a small surplus tucked away in a coffee can in his workshop. It wasn't enough for a new 4020, not even close. But it might be enough for this. $50, Jed said, his voice cutting through the chatter. The crowd quieted, heads turned. Frank Miller raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening into a grin of genuine amusement. 50. "Jed, you could buy a whole load of scrap iron for 50. "I got 50, now 75, the auctioneer sang, his rhythm returning now that he had a real bidder. 75, another voice called out, a scrapper from the next county over. He saw the sheer weight of the machine, the value of the steel and copper radiator. Jed didn't hesitate. 100. The scrapper looked at Jed, then at the tractor, and shook his head. Too much work to cut it up for that price. $100 going once, the auctioneer chanted. Frank leaned in closer to Jed. "You're crazy. That thing's got a seized motor, I guarantee it. The pivot's shot. You'll spend $5,000 just to make it move, and you'll still have a piece of junk." "Going twice." Jed's mind was already in his workshop. He could see the engine hanging from the chain hoist. He could feel the grit of the valve grinding compound on his fingertips. He could smell the penetrating oil working its way into the rusted threads of the hub bolts. He wasn't buying a tractor. He was buying a challenge. He was buying freedom from a monthly payment slip. "Sold?" The auctioneer's hammer fell with a crack. "For $100 to Jed Stone. You bought yourself a real prize there, Jed." The laughter was louder this time. Frank just shook his head slowly, a look of pity on his face, as he turned and walked back toward his gleaming green machine. "Your funeral," he muttered, loud enough for Jed to hear. Jed ignored him. He walked over to the crippled giant, the dust puffing up around his worn work boots. He placed a hand on the cold, rusty fender. The steel felt solid, honest. It owed nothing to anyone. It was his, every broken, rusted, seized-up piece of it. He could already hear the thunder of that big Cummins coming back to life, a sound that would be paid for in sweat and grease, not interest and principal. Now, before we get to Jed hauling that beast home and tearing into the guts of it, I have to ask you all a question. Have you ever done something like this? Stood at an auction or looked in a fence row and saw potential where everyone else saw scrap? Have you ever bought a piece of old iron that your neighbors and friends all called a fool's bargain, but you knew deep in your bones that it had a second life in it? Let me know down in the comments what machine it was and how the story ended. I read every single one of them. Getting the versatile home was a battle in itself. He hired a local heavy hauler, a man with a grim-faced Mack truck and a lowboy trailer that had seen better days. It took 2 hours with a winch and a series of chains wrapped around the solid rear axle just to drag the dead tractor onto the trailer bed. The tortured groan of twisting metal and the screech of locked-up tires on the steel deck made even the stoic truck driver wince. By the time they chained it down, it looked even more pathetic, a captive monster being hauled off to its doom. Frank Miller made sure to drive by on the county road just as they were pulling out, slowing his 40-20 to a crawl and giving Jed a long, slow shake of the head. Jed didn't wave back. He just paid the driver and directed him to the big double doors of his workshop. The building was old, built by his grandfather with rough-sawn oak timbers and a corrugated tin roof that sang a mournful tune in the rain. Inside, it was a cathedral of self-reliance. Tools hung in their designated places on the walls, decades of grease staining the outlines of wrenches and sockets. A massive I-beam ran the length of the ceiling, supporting a chain hoist capable of lifting 5 tons. The floor was concrete, stained with the ghosts of 100 different repairs, and the air hung thick with the comforting smell of gear oil, diesel fuel, and hot metal. For the next 4 months, as autumn faded and the first snows of winter began to dust the frozen fields, that workshop was Jed's entire world. The first order of business was the engine. Just as Frank had predicted, the big Cummins was seized up tight. Jed pulled the injectors and poured a mixture of diesel and acetone down into the cylinders, letting it soak for a week. Nothing. He put a 4-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt and pulled until the veins in his neck stood out like ropes. The engine didn't budge. With a sigh, he hooked the chain hoist to the lifting eyes on the engine block. The process of separating the engine from the transmission was a dirty, knuckle-busting affair. Bolts, rusted solid after years of neglect, had to be heated with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, then hit with an impact wrench that screamed its protest. One by one, they surrendered with a painful crack. Finally, the massive assembly swung free, dripping black oil onto the floor. He tore it down on a heavy-duty engine stand, piece by piece. The head came off, revealing cylinders filled with a rusty, watery sludge. His heart sank. But as he cleaned them out, he saw the cylinder walls themselves weren't deeply pitted. They could be saved. The real problem was revealed when he pulled the oil pan. The number 3 connecting rod bearing had spun, welding itself to the crankshaft in a mass of melted metal. The crank was deeply scored, blued from the intense heat. It was junk. A new crankshaft was $1,000 he didn't have. He spent 2 days on the phone, calling every salvage yard and machine shop in a 3-state radius. Finally, he found a shop in Des Moines that thought they could save it. "We can turn it down 30 thousandths and weld it back up, but I ain't making no promises," the grizzled machinist told him over the phone. While the crank was gone, Jed worked on the rest of the tractor. He split the machine at the articulation pivot, using hydraulic jacks and oak blocking to support the 2 halves. The main pivot bearings were shot, the steel races galled and pitted. He pressed them out with a 20-ton shop press, the metal shrieking in protest. He ordered new Timken bearings, the best he could get, and packed them meticulously with high-pressure grease. He rebuilt the planetary hubs, replacing every seal and gasket. He drained the milky, water-filled fluid and refilled it with fresh 90-weight gear oil. He rewired the entire machine, tearing out the old, brittle wires with their cracked insulation and replacing them with heavy-gauge cable, soldering every connection and sealing it with heat-shrink tubing. All winter, while Jed worked under the cold glare of fluorescent lights, the talk at the co-op was about Frank Miller. Frank had picked up another 80 acres that bordered the creek. He was talking about buying a bigger planter, a 12-row instead of his 8-row. He'd stop by the diner for coffee in the mornings, clean and confident, talking about cash flow and depreciation. Once in a while, someone would ask, "How's Jed Stone's project coming along?" Frank would laugh. "Last I saw, he had it in about 1,000 pieces. Looks like a bomb went off in his shop. Poor fella's trying to farm like it's 1940. You can't make a living like that anymore. You got to modernize. You got to spend money to make money." And most of the men would nod in agreement. They saw Frank's new equipment, the straight new fences he was putting up, the speed with which he got his crops in. They saw Jed when he came into town for parts, his hands stained black with grease that no soap could remove, his eyes tired. They saw a man falling behind. The pressure was immense, a silent weight in the air every time he left his farm. He was becoming a cautionary tale. By early March, the crankshaft came back from the machine shop, miraculously repaired. Jed spent a week carefully reassembling the engine. He plastigaged every bearing, checking the clearances to 1/1000th of an inch. He torqued the head bolts in their precise, spiraling sequence. He set the valve lash, his fingers working with a delicate, practiced touch. Finally, the day came. The engine was back in the frame, the fuel lines bled, a new battery bolted in place. He climbed into the simple steel seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the massive engine over slowly. Once, twice. Then a puff of white smoke shot from the open exhaust manifold. On the third rotation, it caught. The explosion of noise was deafening. A huge cloud of black smoke filled the workshop as the engine cleared its throat of assembly lube and stale fuel. It settled into a rough, hammering idle that shook the very foundations of the building. The floor vibrated, the tools on the wall rattled, and a grin spread across Jed's face. It was the sound of victory. He let it run for 20 minutes, his eyes scanning the oil pressure and temperature gauges he had temporarily wired up. Everything was holding steady. The beast had a heartbeat. He named it then and there. Not Big Ed. It was too raw, too powerful for a friendly name. He called it the Grizzly. The year was 1972. The world was changing. In a move that would send shockwaves through the American heartland, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, agreed to buy nearly a quarter of the entire US wheat crop, along with millions of tons of corn and soybeans. Overnight, commodity prices shot into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been hovering around $1 a bushel, rocketed past $3. For farmers, it felt like winning the lottery. A sense of unlimited optimism swept across the plains. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, was telling farmers to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Get big or get out. No one listened more intently than Frank Miller. The soaring prices weren't just income to him, they were leverage. With his projected earnings, the bank in town, run by a man named Mr. Abernathy, who loved seeing big loan applications, was willing to extend him a line of credit that would have been unthinkable just a year before. Frank didn't just expand, he exploded. He bought the 320-acre Henderson place when Old Man Henderson retired, paying a premium price that made the coffee shop buzz for a week. To work the new ground, he traded in his nearly new 4020 for a monstrous John Deere 6030, the biggest two-wheel drive tractor Deere had ever made. It was a brute, but it wasn't enough. A year later, he was one of the first in the county to own a John Deere 4630, complete with the revolutionary Soundguard cab. It was a different world in there. Air conditioning, a tinted bubble of glass, an 8-track tape player. Frank would plow his fields listening to Johnny Cash, sealed off from the heat, dust, and noise that was the very definition of farming for every generation before him. He bought a new Gleaner L combine, a massive machine that could swallow 8 rows of corn at a time. He was farming over 1,000 acres, a titan in the county. Jed, meanwhile, felt the pull of the boom times. With corn at $3 a bushel, the money from his modest 240 acres was better than he'd ever seen. He could have walked into the bank and gotten a loan for a new tractor, a new combine, anything he wanted. Mr. Abernathy had even called him, suggesting it was a prime opportunity for investment in his operation. But Jed remembered his father's words. He saw the high prices not as a new reality, but as a temporary gift. He used the windfall to pay off the last of his operating loan from the year before. He replaced the roof on the old barn. He bought his wife a new Frigidaire refrigerator, paying for it in cash. And he put the rest of the money back in the coffee can. He kept farming with his old iron. The Grizzly, now painted a functional coat of caterpillar yellow to ward off the rust, became his primary tillage tractor. It was loud, crude, and uncomfortable. It had no cab, and after a 12-hour day of dissing, Jed's ears would ring and his bones would ache from the vibration. But it pulled a 24-foot field cultivator without breaking a sweat, the Cummins bellowing its deep-throated song across the fields. His old Farmall M, now relegated to lighter duties, handled the planting. He harvested his corn with his old Oliver 77 and a 2-row pull-type picker. It was slow, it was inefficient. While Frank could be done with his harvest in a week, it took Jed 3. The contrast between the two farms was stark, and the community noticed. They saw Frank's ever-expanding fleet of shiny new equipment parked in perfect rows on his pristine farmstead. They saw Jed's mismatched collection of aging machines, weathered and stained, but meticulously maintained. In the eyes of his neighbors, Jed wasn't being prudent, he was being timid. He was a man afraid of progress, a relic being left behind by the march of modern agriculture. The whispers in the diner grew louder. Jed's just letting that good ground go to waste, one would say. He could be farming 500 acres with the money he's making. He's still got that homemade-looking tractor, another would add. Miller's got air conditioning and a radio. Jed's still eating dust. The condescension reached its peak one afternoon at the co-op. Frank, holding court near the feed sacks, saw Jed walk in. "Jed, my man," Frank called out, a magnanimous smile on his face. "I've been meaning to talk to you. I know you're running a bit of a shoestring operation over there. With all this new ground I've got, I'm stretched a little thin on time, but I'd be willing to do you a favor. I'll cash rent your acres from you, give you a fair price. It'll save you the headache of keeping that old junk running, and you'll have a guaranteed check in your pocket." The implication was clear, hanging in the dusty air for all to hear. You can't handle it. Let a real farmer take over. Jed looked at Frank, his face calm. He thought of the hours spent bringing the Grizzly back from the dead, the feel of the controls in his hands, the satisfaction of turning his own soil with a machine he owned free and clear. "Thanks for the offer, Frank," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "but I'm doing just fine." He turned and walked to the parts counter, leaving Frank with a look of stunned disbelief on his face. The other farmers shuffled their feet, unsure what to say. Later that week, as Jed was tuning the carburetor on his Farmall, he had the radio on in the shop. A news report came on. The announcer's voice was grave, talking about an oil embargo by a group of countries he'd barely heard of. He spoke of skyrocketing fuel prices and something called runaway inflation. The Federal Reserve, the announcer said, was considering raising interest rates to cool down the economy. Jed shut the radio off, a knot tightening in his stomach. Out on the horizon, beyond the shimmering prosperity of the boom, he could see a dark line of clouds gathering. A storm was coming, and he had a feeling that horsepower and shiny paint wouldn't be enough to weather it. The first sign of trouble wasn't a crack of thunder or a bank notice, it was a sound, or rather, the lack of one. It was a hot afternoon in late July of 1979, the air thick and humming with the drone of cicadas. Jed was greasing the kingpins on his old grain truck when he noticed the silence from the west. For weeks, the deep, muffled roar of Frank Miller's John Deere 4630 had been a constant presence on the horizon as Frank worked his vast acreage, the sound barely penetrating the insulated Soundguard cab, but rolling for miles across the flat land. Now it was gone. Later that day, Jed drove into town for a hydraulic filter. He saw the big green tractor parked awkwardly at the edge of Frank's field, a pool of iridescent fluid shimmering on the dirt beneath its belly. The next morning, the implement dealer's service truck was there, a mobile hospital for a wounded giant. The talk at the parts counter was that the main hydraulic pump had failed, sending a shower of fine metal shavings through the entire closed-center system. It wasn't a simple fix. Every hydraulic motor, every valve, every line would have to be flushed, the transmission case split. The bill, they whispered, would be north of $5,000, and the tractor would be down for a week at the peak of the season. Jed just nodded, paid for his filter, and left. $5,000 was what he'd made in profit his entire first year of farming. To see it evaporate on a single repair for a single machine sent a chill down his spine. That autumn, the second sign appeared. The price of diesel fuel, which had hovered around 40 cents a gallon for years, suddenly jumped to 75 cents, then 90. By spring, it was over $1. For Jed, with his 240 acres and the fuel-sipping Cummins in the Grizzly, it was a painful but manageable increase. For Frank Miller, farming over 1,000 acres with 2 big tractors and a combine that drank 50 gallons in an afternoon, it was a hemorrhage. He was spending hundreds of dollars a day just on fuel. The easy confidence began to drain from Frank's face. Jed would see him at the co-op, his jaw tight, arguing with the manager over the price of fertilizer, which was also skyrocketing. The new denim jackets were replaced with older frayed ones. The smell of expensive aftershave was gone, replaced by the sour scent of stress. Then came the hammer blow. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The market, which had been the foundation of the decade's prosperity, collapsed overnight. Corn prices plummeted back toward $2 a bushel. The math of modern farming suddenly inverted. The massive loans taken out when corn was high and land was worth $3,000 an acre were still due, but the income to pay them had been cut in half. The first cracks in Frank's empire began to show. He let his part-time hired man go. The new fences he had been so proud of went unpainted. Weeds started to creep up around the edges of his meticulously manicured farmstead. One evening, Jed was working late in his shop, rebuilding the water pump on his Farmall M, when he saw headlights turn into his lane. It was Frank, driving his pickup. He didn't get out right away, just sat there with the engine idling, the headlights illuminating the open doors of Jed's shop, lighting up the Grizzly parked inside. Finally, he killed the engine and walked into the light. His boots crunching on the gravel. He looked tired, older than his years. "Jed," he said, his voice rough, "that deer of mine. The injectors are acting up again. Dealer wants $600 just to look at it." He kicked at a loose stone on the floor. "I was wondering, I heard you know your way around a diesel engine. Wondered if you might take a look?" It was the hardest thing Frank Miller had ever had to say. The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "You were right. I was wrong. I'm in trouble." Jed wiped his hands on a red rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked past Frank, at the darkness where 1,000 acres of debt lay waiting. He thought of the laughter at the auction, the condescending advice, the pitying looks. He could have said no, he could have enjoyed the moment. Instead, he looked at Frank's worn face and saw not a rival, but another farmer caught in the jaws of a trap. "Pull it in the morning," Jed said, his voice even. "We'll take a look together." The winter of 1981 was brutal, not just in its weather, but in its economics. A new man was in charge of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, and he was determined to kill inflation by any means necessary. He cranked up the prime interest rate. It climbed to 15%, then 18%. By the time it peaked, it was a staggering 21.5%. For anyone with a variable rate loan, it was a death sentence. The phone calls to the Miller house started in January. Mr. Abernathy, the banker who had once greeted Frank with a hearty slap on the back and a cigar, was now a cold, disembodied voice on the line. He spoke of covenants, obligations, and restructuring. The friendly language of partnership was gone, replaced by the sterile vocabulary of foreclosure. The Miller farm began to be dismantled piece by piece. First, Frank sold off the newest equipment to try and raise cash. The big Gleaner L combine, only a few years old, was the first to go, sold to a large operator from another state for a fraction of what Frank had paid. He planned to hire a custom harvester, a bitter pill for a man who had once been the first to finish his own work. Next went the John Deere 6030. He kept the 4630, the one with the problematic hydraulics and the massive loan payment, because it was his only big tractor left. But it wasn't enough. The interest on his land loans was compounding faster than he could pay it down. What had been manageable payments at 8% became crippling burdens at 18%. He was drowning. Jed watched it all from a distance, with a heavy heart. The crisis was tearing through the county like a prairie fire. For sale signs popped up on farms that had been in the same family for 100 years. Every week the local paper was filled with auction notices, each one a tombstone for a failed dream. The men who gathered at the diner no longer talked about expansion and new iron. They spoke in hushed, fearful tones about interest rates and bankruptcy court. They looked at Jed differently now. His quiet, debt-free operation was no longer a sign of timidity. It was an island of stability in a raging sea. Jed survived because his costs were fixed and low. His land was paid for. The Grizzly didn't have a payment book. Its only appetite was for diesel and grease. When an axle seal started to leak that spring, Jed didn't have to call a dealer. He pulled the hub himself, drove to town and matched the seal at the auto parts store for $12 and had it fixed by lunchtime. He was burning his own fuel, turning his own wrenches and answering to no one but himself. The coffee can in his workshop, once a symbol of his caution, was now his fortress. While his neighbors were desperately trying to borrow money at ruinous rates just to put a crop in, Jed paid for his seed and fertilizer with cash. The end for Frank came on a grey day in May. Jed was cultivating his North 40 when he saw the cars pull into Frank's lane. A county sheriff's deputy and two men in suits from the bank. He watched from across the fence row as they walked to the house. A little while later, Frank's wife Mary came out and drove away, her face a mask of grief. The men stayed, walking around the machine shed, making notes on a clipboard. They were taking inventory. The auction was scheduled for the second Saturday in June. The sale bill was a full page in the newspaper, a heartbreaking catalogue of a life's work. Having been instructed by the First National Bank of Black Hawk County, it began. It listed everything: the 4630 tractor, the planters, the discs, the household goods, even the children's swing set. At the bottom of the list, in stark, brutal type, was the land, 1,040 acres, to be sold in separate parcels. The morning of the auction was unnaturally quiet, the sky the color of lead. A huge crowd gathered, not with the festive air of a consignment sale, but with the somber mood of a wake. Farmers came from 3 counties around, their faces grim. They were there to witness the final public execution of one of their own, and they all knew it could just as easily be them. Frank stood near the porch, a ghost on his own farm. His eyes were hollow. Mary was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, stood near the auctioneer's truck, looking uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with the farmers he'd once courted so aggressively. Jed arrived and stood at the back of the crowd. He wasn't there to bid on the big items. He had no interest in expanding his acres or buying another man's trouble. He was there to bear witness. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools from the shop. Wrenches and socket sets, things Frank had held in his own hands, were sold for pennies on the dollar to strangers. Then came the tractors. The John Deere 4630, Frank's pride and joy, was driven before the crowd. It was dirty, one tire low on air. It looked as defeated as its owner. The bidding was sluggish. In a healthy market, it would have brought a good price. But these were not healthy times. The farmers who had the cash to buy weren't spending, and those who needed a tractor couldn't get a loan. It sold for a shockingly low price to a dealer from out of state who would haul it away and part it out. Jed watched Frank flinch as the hammer fell, as if he'd been struck. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the land. This was the true death of the farm. The parcels were sold one by one. Large investors and insurance companies, circling like vultures, bought up the prime ground, land that Frank's grandfather had cleared with horses. Then they came to the last parcel. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called out. "Lot number 7, the original 80 acres, includes the house, the barn, and all outbuildings." This was the Miller home place, the heart of it all. A hush fell over the crowd. The bidding started low. One of the investors made a bid. A neighbor, hoping to add a few acres, raised it. The investor bid again, his voice cold and impersonal. It looked like he would take it all. Jed felt a surge of something hot and sharp in his chest. It wasn't about the land, it was about the house where Mary had raised her kids, the barn where Frank's father had milked his cows. He thought of the coffee can in his shop, full of the cash he had saved during the good years, money earned by his own sweat and his own caution. 50,000, Jed's voice cut through the silence. Every head turned. Frank looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Abernathy stared, his mouth slightly open. The investor from the city scowled, annoyed by the interruption. He conferred with his partner, then shook his head. At that price, with the falling land values, it wasn't a bargain anymore. "I have 50,000, the auctioneer chanted, his eyes on Jed. 50,000, going once. He looked around the crowd. No one moved. Going twice. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Sold, the hammer cracked, for $50,000 to Jed Stone. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't a cheer, but it was a sound of approval, of relief. Jed didn't look at anyone. He walked to the clerk's table, his face set like stone, and arranged to pay in cash on Monday morning. As the crowd began to disperse, Jed saw Frank still standing by the porch, looking lost. Jed walked over to him. The two men stood for a moment, the space between them filled with the ghosts of a decade of rivalry and misunderstanding. "Why, Jed?" Frank's voice was barely a whisper. "Why'd you do it?" "It's not right," Jed said, looking at the old barn. "A man's home. It's not right for it to be just another number on an investor's ledger." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, the keys to his own pickup truck. "I'm going to need someone to look after the place for me. Keep the yard mowed, make sure the pipes don't freeze this winter. I'll rent the house to you. $100 a month. You can work it off on the land." He pressed the keys into Frank's hand. "You and Mary stay. This is your home." Tears welled in Frank Miller's eyes. He looked at the man he had once mocked, the man whose quiet wisdom had weathered the storm that had destroyed him. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, clutching the keys in his hand like a lifeline. Life settled into a new rhythm in Black Hawk County. The scars of the farm crisis remained, but the bleeding had stopped. Jed Stone became a quiet pillar of the community. He never got big. He continued to farm his original 240 acres, plus the 80 acres he now owned. He hired Frank to help him during planting and harvest. The two men worked side by side, a quiet respect having replaced the old rivalry. Frank eventually got a job driving a truck for the co-op, and with the steady paycheck and the home Jed had saved for them, he and Mary slowly began to rebuild their lives. The talk in the diner changed for good. The young farmers, the ones just starting out, would seek Jed out. They wouldn't ask him about horsepower or acres, they'd ask him about cash flow and maintenance schedules. They'd ask him how to rebuild a transmission or how to fabricate a part they couldn't afford to buy new. He never preached. He just showed them in his quiet way, opening the doors to his workshop and sharing the knowledge he had earned with his own two hands. Years passed. Jed grew older, his hair turning the color of winter wheat, his hands permanently stained with the story of his work. His son, Tom, came back to the farm after college. One Saturday afternoon, Jed found him in the shop, staring at the Grizzly. The yellow paint was faded and chipped, the huge tires worn smooth, but the big Cummins engine still fired up with the same thunderous roar. "Dad," Tom said, running a hand over the tractor's rusty fender, "I was looking at the new four-wheel drives. They've got GPS, climate control, 300 horsepower." Jed walked over and stood next to his son. He looked at the old tractor, seeing not a machine of iron and steel, but a monument to a philosophy. He remembered the laughter at the auction where he'd bought it a lifetime ago. "Horsepower is easy to buy, son," Jed said, his voice soft but clear. "You can get all the horsepower you want at the bank, but control is different. This tractor," he slapped the fender, the sound a dull, solid thud, "taught me that the most powerful thing on a farm isn't the engine. It's the word paid for." He looked at his son, his eyes full of a lifetime of wisdom. "Your great-grandfather told me something I never forgot. He said, 'The bank ain't your partner, it's a landlord, and the rent is always due.' You remember that? You buy what you can afford, you maintain what you own, and you'll survive any storm that comes your way. Because you'll be the one holding the keys, not some man in a suit in a town office. Tom nodded, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He looked from his father to the old, ugly tractor, and for the first time he didn't see a relic. He saw a legacy. He saw the heart of the farm still beating, strong and steady. And he knew that some things, like the land itself, were worth more than money could ever buy. They were worth holding on to.